Hello, welcome. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Susan Mendes Foundation to another one of our Sunday programs. You've seen a sensational film in preparation for today's program. It's called Into the Arms of Strangers. This is a film that I saw when it came out 23 years ago, and it's stayed with me ever since, and I'm sure it will have the same effect on you. This is a film that will last for many years to come. It's really quite extraordinary. And we have the filmmaker himself, Mark Jonathan Harris, two-time Oscar-winning filmmaker. We also have Dr. Mordechai Paldiel, the historian, who will tell us not only about what led to the Kindertransport program to England, but he will put the story in the wider context and explain what was going on at that same time in the United States. He'll talk about why we didn't have such a program here in the United States. And joining us from the United Kingdom is Lady Milena Grenfell Baines, who was herself one of these rescued children who went to England in 1939, and she's here to tell you her personal story and what a privilege it is to have her among us so that through her, we're able to touch history. So right now, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Mordechai Paldiel. And let me just remind the audience that you can start typing your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them at the right moment in the program. So Dr. Paldiel, Mordechai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. Well, today's program is dedicated to the Kindertransport. But let us remind ourselves that the Kindertransport started as a result of that vast and horrible pogrom known as Kristallnacht in Germany, the largest pogrom that ever happened in Germany. But I want to talk a little bit about pogroms. Pogroms is both a curse, but in some instances, it turned into a blessing. What I have in mind are the pogroms and during the Russian Empire. The pogroms began actually in Russia, and it's a Russian word, pogrom. It began in 1882, and over 2 million Jews left the Russian Empire at that time, which included Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, parts of Poland. And most of them came to the United States. You have some photos here of people getting off the Ellis Island. I want to say something. The Russians were interested for the Jews to leave, and the Americans were interested for the Jews to come in then. There were no restrictions, no visas, no transit visas, no nothing. They just took a medical inspection when they came to Ellis Island. I just want to add something else. Before this program, I went online and I checked that some of the major Jewish entertainers in the United States, their parents and grandparents came here as a result of the pogroms in Russia. I have in mind, like, you heard his names, Kirk Douglas, George Burns, Groucho Marx, Woody Allen, Jack Benny, Mike Todd, Louis Mayer, Steven Spielberg, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Leonard Bernstein. Their grandparents came here because America was open and the Russians were interested for Jews to get out, and Jews came to America during that period, 1882, 1914. Next slide. But in 1938, the situation was different. Nazi Germany was then practicing a policy called forced immigration, just like the Russians in the 1880s, for the Jews to get out. They hadn't passed through extermination. And Jews wanted to leave Germany, but the gates of the United States, Canada, and the free countries were locked. So here you have a cartoon on the bottom right, which came out in the 1930s. And you have the Statue of Liberty holding a sign, "Keep out." And at the bottom, you have a boat, one of the refugee boats returning to Europe. So that's the tragedy of which led to the Kindertransport. That in 1938, Jews wanted to get out of Europe, but they had no place where to go. If the world had been more magnanimous, perhaps there wouldn't have been a Holocaust as we know it today. There would have been persecutions, but not mass killing. Next slide. In fact, after the Evian conference in July 1938, Nazi Germany and the conferees, they created a committee on the refugees, which existed from 38-39. At the head of the committee was the American George Robley, and on the German side was the Nazi finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht, who, with the approval of Hitler, they negotiated for months and months and months the exit of German Jews. There were different plans. It's a whole topic. Books were written about this. But the Nazis were saying, okay, if we get the Jews out of Germany, which we are interested, we don't want Jews, do you have a place where to go? And the answer was, no, not yet, not yet. And so the negotiations dragged down until the start of World War II. And the Nazis realized that the United States, Canada, England, and the other democracies were not interested in allowing the Jews to come to their countries. Next slide. At the Evian conference, Adolf Hitler made a speech, and he said, I can only hope and expect that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, he called the Jews criminals, but that's Adolf Hitler, will at least be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We on our part are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries for all I care, even on luxury boats. And he was sincere. At that time, this crazy guy, this maniac, simply wanted the Jews out of Germany and later on out of the other countries that the Germans occupied. If they could go any place in the world, he would have been happy. He was hoping, of course, he was the greatest anti-Semite in history, but at that time he was not yet thinking, he was talking about it, but he was not yet thinking of actually carrying out a vast extermination plan. So as Walter Mondale, the future vice president, in 1979, when he was vice president, he stated, at stake at Evian were both human lives and the decency and self-respect of the civilized world. If each nation at Evian, that's the conference in France, had agreed on that day to take in 70,000 Jews, or at once, every Jew in Germany could have been saved. And he's absolutely right. But it did not happen. So that's the difference between 38 and the 1880s during the original pogroms in the Russian Empire. Next slide. On the left, you have a boat, the St. Louis boat, left Germany in May 1939 with over 900 Jews who had received immigration permits to the United States. They had been approved for the United States, but they had to wait their line. And waiting their line took 2 years. So they decided they'd rather wait their time in Cuba as tourists rather than stay in Germany after Kristallnacht, when Jews were no longer physically safe. But when they arrived in Cuba, the Cuban government changed its mind, and the boat had to go all the way back to Europe. The United States refused to allow them to land. The boat, even the captains of the boat took the boat off the shores of Fort Lauderdale in Florida. But these people had been approved for immigration, but they had to wait for 2 years. And this, to the Nazis, this seems very strange, that the United States could not find a way to admit 937 Jews that had been approved for immigration. This is May, June 1939. Instead of that, there were other ideas. President Roosevelt came up with the idea of, well, we can't admit him to the United States because of all the immigration restrictions, but how about moving these Jews to Angola, which belonged to Portugal, in Africa, which seemed to be large enough, and it had, climate was okay, it had rich natural resources. Move him to Portugal and study that. But the leader of Portugal, Salazar, said, no, I don't want any Jews in Angola. Angola would become a Jewish state. And so another idea came, how about Madagascar? So there's a whole thing about the Madagascar plan. Madagascar then belonged to France, as part of the French Empire. It's large enough, it's almost the size of Texas. And again, the Germans were interested. They said, all right, we'll ship all the Jews to Madagascar. Just get him out of Germany, get him out of Europe. But again, there was no proper response from the good guys, from the Western democracy. In the meantime, the war broke out. Next slide. So these are pictures of the Kindertransport. I put it here to point out the British agreed to only 10,000 children. That's it, 10,000. Without their parents, because if their parents come, they would compete for jobs in Britain. But the children would not compete for jobs. And the Jewish organization had to pay for their upkeep. So the British agreed, 10,000. As far as the Nazis were concerned, and I feel very awkward when I speak on, when I say a good word about the Nazis. They were interested in not only 10,000 children. If the British wanted to take out 100,000 children, the Nazis would have said, all right, take them out, because they didn't want anyone to stay in Germany. But the 10,000 children were the ones that got out in time before the actual war. Once the war broke out on September 1939, no more children could be gotten out from Germany. These children survived, and most of their parents did not. They died in the Holocaust. Most. Some of them made it to England as domestic servants and another, but over 90% of the parents of these children did not survive the war years. Next slide. So when the British came out with the Kindertransport plan, there was a demand in the United States to do something similar and to admit not 10,000, 20,000 children in the United States. Again, this would not, the American taxpayer would not have to pay for their upkeep. Jewish organizations like the Joint would take care of that. Jewish hosting families would take their children. And so the bill was introduced in the Senate, and it went through various discussions. There was a lot of opposition. There was a greater opposition in the United States than in England to admit Jewish children. The opposition was, these are Jews, they're foreigners, they will grow up, they will be against the United States. Charity begins at home. Let's care about our own children before foreign children. So the bill was introduced by Senator Wagner from New York and Congresswoman Rogers. I forgot already, she's either from Connecticut or Massachusetts. Next slide. And here's a cartoon of these children knocking on the door of the United States. And this man, who it says conference or convention, this is like a senator. He is thinking, he is belaboring himself whether to open the door. And the bill failed in committee. It never came to a vote. And these 20,000 children were never admitted in the United States. So this is the tragedy of those days. Before I turn over the floor to Mark Harris, I want to point out when the war broke out and the British were in disarray and the Germans were bombing London, known as the Blitz, the United States was ready to admit British children to the United States. The United States said, bring over the children so they won't have to face the bombings. But then Winston Churchill canceled that idea. He felt that if the children were to be brought out of England without their parents, that would have a bad moral effect on the parents, and they wouldn't stand up to the need of fighting Nazi Germany in 1940-41 when England was down and England was in a very bad situation. So the British children were not sent to the United States, but America was ready to admit British children. But a year earlier, Jewish children, no, that's a different story. So I've just finished, and just to point out that the Holocaust did not need to happen as it happened. It need not have been so horrible as it turned out. If the Western world had a greater inclination to be more humanitarian and to have a greater heart to admit Jewish refugees, that the Germans didn't want to stay in Europe. By refusing to admit that, they sent the wrong signals to Hitler, and he decided, well, they don't want it, and we don't want them to stay. Well, we have no other choice. We have to pass to another plan, and the other plan was, of course, extermination. Okay, and now I'm finished with my introduction and giving the context of those years 38, 39, 40, and now I pass the floor and the microphone to the producer of that amazing, excellent film, Mark Harris. Mark, the floor is yours. Take it.
Thank you, Mordecai, and thank you, Olivia, for showing the film and inviting me to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about the genesis of the film and my experience making it. All films are collaborations, and this film was a collaboration with Deborah Oppenheimer. Deborah approached me after seeing another film that I made about the Holocaust, which was The Long Way Home. The Long Way Home documents the period from the liberation of the concentration camps to the birth of the state of Israel, that seminal 3-year period. And Deborah came to me because her mother had been one of the people on the Kindertransport. Her mother left Germany, Chemnitz, when she was 11 years old, and went to England and lived in a hostel. And Deborah and her brother and her sister knew about this, that her mother lived in a castle as part of the Kindertransport and cried herself to sleep every night. And there was a tacit understanding from the 3 children that not to talk about this, because whenever they brought it up, Deborah's mother cried. So they understood this was just too painful. And Deborah's mother died rather young, and Deborah realized that she did not know anything about her mother's background in the Kindertransport. When she approached me, I said, look, I've already done a film about the Kindertransport, about the Holocaust. I don't want to do another film. I don't think I have anything to say. But Deborah is an incredibly persistent person, and she presented me with books, stories, and gradually I came to see the story in a different way. I have written several children's books, and the children's books that I've written all deal with children dealing with problems created by adults, problems not of their own making. And this is probably the greatest problem that a child could face, dealing with the consequences of war. This is not a problem that children create. It's a problem created by adults. And the 2 largest traumas of any child's life are losing family and home. So I was drawn into the story in that way. I also had a personal connection to the story. My grandfather came in that great migration that Mordecai spoke about at the turn of the century in America, among the 2 million refugees. And he came to America as a 12-year-old boy, not speaking any English. And I was very close to my grandfather, but he died when I was 6. So I really did not know my grandfather's story. And this sort of the emotional lacuna in both Deborah and my life, understanding our grandparents' past, was the motivation for this film. Then both of us said there were 10,000 children who were saved by the British. There are 10,000 possible stories here. How do you choose which stories to tell in the film? So we interviewed over 300 people, looking for a kind of cross-section of people and a variety of experiences. So some of the children you see in the film had positive experiences. Some had experiences that were much more difficult. What's interesting is, and this is true of many people, survivors of the Holocaust, and a lot of children of the Kindertransport, the children from the Kindertransport don't see themselves as survivors, but they all experienced a lot of trauma. And many of them did not speak about their trauma. They certainly didn't speak about it to their children. They often were able to speak about it to their grandchildren, because they didn't speak about it to their children because they wanted to spare their children the pain that they experienced. It was easier for them to talk to their grandparents. And some of the people in our film had not talked about their experience at all. One, Ursula Rosenfeld. If you've seen the film, you remember she was the girl whose birthday party no one came to. Her father was killed during Kristallnacht. She and her sister were put into an orphanage. She remembers her mother at the train station. That was the last time she ever saw her mother. And she had not really spoken emotionally about her experience before. We saw a tape of her, and we were taken with her sort of stoic attitude. So we interviewed her, and the interview turned out to be far more emotional than she imagined. And afterwards, she said she had always had nightmares about her experience in Germany. But after telling this story, and in such an emotional way, her nightmares stopped. This interviewing people who've had such traumatic experiences can be very cathartic. It's very important to bear witness. Many of the people, and I'm sure Mordecai will agree, who survived the concentration camps, they were told by their other people, you have to survive to tell this story. But when they came to America, many people did not want to, and England, many people did not want to hear the story of survivors. And there was a wall of silence among many people, the survivors of the Kindertransport. There's a wonderful quotation from Bruno Bettelheim, the child psychiatrist, who says, what can't be talked about can also not be put to rest. And if it's not, the wounds continue to fester from generation to generation. And I think, that was one of the reasons that Deborah wanted to explore this, because she felt, and we saw this in many cases, that the unexpressed sadness and pain were passed on to the next generation. In the film, Laurie Siegel talks about cutting off her emotions at 12 and deciding not to cry, and what the cost of that was. So that's a lot of what the film is about, I think. And I think it's that's one of the things that was so moving for me in making the film, to have our subjects speak so openly about their experience. My cinematographer said he never shot so many interviews with tears in his eyes. So now I want to pass the microphone to someone who had this experience herself, Milena Grenfell-Baines. Milena?
Hello, everybody. Well, the first slide will show you a picture of myself, 1938, aged 8.5, with my little sister, who was coming up to 3, walking very happily with my father, knowing nothing at all what was going on around the world, not knowing that 2 years previously, my father had actually obtained Czech passports for the writer Thomas Mann, and the consequences that would bring later on. And we were living a very normal, happy life. 1939. My father, on the 13th of March, had been warned to leave Prague, knowing he was to be told he was to be arrested by the Gestapo. In May, my mother suddenly got a message that she was to put my sister, 3.5, me, 9.5, on a train to travel to England. It's such a long time ago. I know it happened. It's difficult to actually remember, but that was the photograph, we think, that was sent to the man who eventually helped to rescue us. On the eve of my departure, which was on the 21st of July, at the railway station, my grandfather came and he gave me an autograph book. It was very useful during the war, and there you see names of some of the children that I actually attended school with, and you can see the dates on those pages, 1943, 1942. But prior to that, I must tell you what happened. On that evening of the 31st of July, my grandfather, Emil Cosiner, who was at the railway station, gave me the book. And in it, he wrote, remember to remain a faithful daughter of the country you're leaving, and to your parents and to your grandfather, who loves you very much. He had the foresight to ask some of my uncles and aunts and cousins to also write dedication in that book, because when the final solution was to take place in 1942, that is when my grandfather and my grandmother and my cousins, who were actually the same ages as my sister and I were taken away, first of all to Terezin, and then to a camp called Mali Trostinets, which was one of the 400 camps that actually were in Poland, and they were extermination camps. Once he was there, he lasted for 4 weeks before he and my grandmother were killed. On the train that we traveled on, we had to wear labels. And although that label is number 641, my sister, in many, many years later, in her 60s, who still has her label, decided to write a poem about labels. And I'm going to read one of the poems to you. Her number was 639. 639, a label hangs around my neck. Fleischmann, the British Refugee Committee, destination Liverpool Street Station. A brown broken label with a missing piece and a misspelled word hangs on my neck. 639. This brown broken label with a missing piece and its misspelled word, in its imperfect whole, identifies me. It hangs around my neck. It holds me in its thrall. Such evidence of conflict in reasons, such pure dichotomy, such unbelievable opposition, so much illogical logic, pure evil, and so much good. How can all so rest in one? But on my label they do. 639 is my number, my label. My brown wrinkled label with a missing piece and a misspelt word. In its imperfect whole, bears witness. It hangs still on my soul. That I'm here to honor and celebrate us all. And that was one of the poems that ever my sister wrote about her label. So we have another slide coming up. On the train, we also needed some documents. And this is one that shows, that's my picture. And we sailed from Holland, which is where we traveled to Harwich, where we were given permission to board. And again, I have very little memories of that journey, but you know, children often remember food, because I know when we came to Holland, which was still a free country, the Dutch people gave us chocolate and bananas, I was told, but it was all very different on the ship. We had never seen the sea, we had never seen big ships. And again, many of us who met later on, and particularly my friends at school, talked about this. We were given cups of tea with milk. And back home, no one ever drank tea with milk. In fact, you were hardly ever given tea unless you were not too well. And we were also given white bread sandwiches. And that was very unlike the lovely Czech rye bread we were all wishing for. And I know that one of my colleagues, one of my friends at school, told me that when she got to England and the person that they were living with unwrapped her rucksack and saw the brown bread, which she hadn't eaten, thought it was going moldy and threw it out. And she'd never forgotten that her lovely Czech bread had thrown out. However, we very quickly got used to the English diet. And so we sailed to Liverpool. There we were met by our English foster parents. We got to know them as Daddy and Mummy Ratcliffe, Roland and she was actually Florrie. And they had a 16-year-old daughter called Mary. And you can see how happy we were looking. And because they lived in a terrace house, and that was a what we called a 2 up and 2 down. It had a front room, a kitchen with a bath in it, and 2 bedrooms. And the toilet at that time was still in the yard. Well, because they didn't want to separate us, they sent Mary to live with a grandmother. Excuse me. We were very happy with the Ratcliffes. I do have some memories. She was an excellent cook, and things like plum pies and Yorkshire pudding rest in my memory. I discovered roller skates, and in my autograph book, this is what Daddy Ratcliffe wrote. To give is to receive, ever and milliner, always in our memories. And we were indeed very happy with them. However, a year went by, and to my great amazement, our mother appeared. And so we became family, because my father was already in England, although he had been ill and not able to look after us. He and my mum and us two were able to set up and live together in a little house. And the next slide. And so we lived and grew up, and you'll be very surprised to see now the King of England. During the war, I had been sent to a boarding school, which was specially for Czech children, where I met some of the people that I traveled on the boat with, and then left the school, grew up, and eventually became a nanny. And later on, when the Holocaust was more talked about, Prince Charles decided to invite the survivors to St. James's Palace once a year for afternoon tea. And I was lucky enough to find myself sitting next to him. And it so happened that I had one relation who survived 3 camps. Her name was Zuzana Růžičková, and she eventually became, in spite of all the dreadful things that happened to her and to her hands, a most famous harpsichord performer. And I had a complete selection of the recording of the Bach, all Bach compositions. And I gave them to Prince Charles because I knew he liked classical music, and he himself played the cello. And he passed them on to his equerry, who then came to the table and asked me for more detail. And 3 weeks later, I had a letter from Susanna to say that Prince Charles, now King Charles, had written to her and said how much he appreciated the music. A number of years later, and I'll come back to Nicholas Winton, but one of us, the children, he was living in Israel, and he was visiting Nicholas Winton. And he said, you know, Nicholas, everybody knows about you. People know about us. But it's our parents who are the real heroes of sending the children to England. And we should do something about this. This is what Nicholas said. But Hugo lived in Israel. So in 2015, I received a call from him saying, look, we really must do something about a memorial. Can you do something about it? I had one friend in Prague who was also on the train, who was also in the school, and who was also one of the now few survivors of us, and said to Susanna, look, what are we going to do? So I went over to Prague, and a little committee was set up with a competition from the Czech art school to design a memorial. And we didn't like any of the results. And yet my friend said to me, you know, I remember being on the station and our parents waving to us, and we at the behind the windows waving back. And we said, that is the memorial. And in Slovakia, we found a man who restored trains. And indeed, in the museum, they found a carriage dating back to 1939, very similar, in which we might have been traveling. And he copied the door. And in the Czech Republic, we found a glass engraver made the glass panel. And he came over to England to take the impressions of my great-granddaughter's little hands, and back in Prague of the impressions of the great-grandson of my friend. And the impressions of the big hands are us. And we are representing the parents and the children that were eventually sent to safety. And this memorial stands on the Prague railway station. And there you see pictures, flowers lying on the stone. And I have been back to Prague a number of times, and I see the station. And indeed, I see people leaving flowers as they hurry to catch their train. And that is the tribute to the parents who were brave enough to send us. But what of the man who actually did all this? Who was Nicholas Winton? The next slide. I think we better just go back. We seem to have skipped one. I need to explain that. One of my trips touring, I went to Japan, and I heard that in Tokyo there was a school that took its pupils back to Europe because long way from Japan, and they had been linked with Holland with the Anne Frank talk, and they had indeed outside the school an Anne Frank garden. That they heard that I was in Tokyo and invited me to come to the school to give my talk about my travels and my rescue to England. And of course, mine was in Czech, and it was being translated into Japanese. And to my great surprise, I discovered that my one sentence took about 5 sentences in the Japanese language. But the children enjoyed it, and here you can see the picture. And the teacher who's not on the picture is the one who made it her business to bring them to Europe every year, each class, to remember the Holocaust. And so now we come to Nicholas Winton. Well, at this point, he was actually visiting me. He must have been in his very late 80s. But let's go back to 40 years, because for 40 years, none of us knew how we got on those trains, how we came to England. And as the previous speaker said, our parents never talked about it. We didn't know until one day I received a telephone call. I was in the kitchen, and this lady said, "This is Esther Ranson." It was like somebody saying, "This is Bill Gates." And I said, "Oh yes, I'm the Queen of England." And the lady said, "Oh no, I thought somebody was making a joke. This is Esther Ranson, and just tell me your name." And I said it was Milena Fleischman. I said, "Right." She said, "Oh, I have in my hands a scrapbook belonging to a man called Nicholas Winton. And that scrapbook tells the entire story, how he came to Prague in 1939 in January, because he was asked to go to help to help a group which was being led by Doreen Warriner and Trevor Chadwick to rescue some of the children. The adults had been sent there to help to rescue the adults who were in imminent danger. They desperately needed someone to cope with the children. And Nicholas was due to go on a winter skiing holiday. But another of his friends called Martin Blake got in touch with him, sent him a message, said, "Look, forget the skiing, come to Prague. We need someone to help with the children." And so he did. He flew, he opened an office in St. Wenceslas Square. And within 2 days, he had a queue of 2,000 parents begging him to put their children's name on the list to get them to England. But again, as your previous speaker said, no more refugees. England said, "Mr. Winton, if you want to bring any children into England from now on, you must find the parents and you must find the money, £50 for each child, so that they can be repatriated at the end of the war." So after 3 weeks in the Czech Republic, he came back to England, and with the help of his mother and another lady, set up an office and started the only way he could, by advertising in newspapers and magazines for families who would take up children. And I do have a page at home of out of a magazine which has 20 letters in it from parents saying, yes, we will take 2 children. And I can only think that is how we ended up with Daddy and Mummy Ratcliffe. Nicholas lived to a very old age. He was 106 when he died. But I visited him regularly. He lived down in the south of England, and I live in the north of England. So I used to go to London and go to Marks and Spencer's and pick up his favorite lunch, which was rice pudding and cauliflower cheese. And we would have that together. And he never liked reminiscing. He always liked talking about the future. But he was a very educated man. He quoted Shakespeare. He played bridge. And he also raised money for an old people's home, which bears the name of Winton House. But my one abiding memory of him is when he was 104 years old. I got a message from Prague from friends that they were flying over to England in a 4-seater Cessna. Now that's an aeroplane with 4 chairs in it, more or less. Would he like a flight? So I phoned Barbara, his daughter. And Barbara said, well, he's in a wheelchair. He's not very well. But yes, he said he would like a flight. And so I drove down to London, and we drove Nicholas out to the airfield. And there was this tiny airplane, and Barbara took one look at it and said, I'm not getting in that. And I climbed in the back, and he sat in front with the pilot. And when the plane took off, each plane has 2 controls. And the pilot pointed to the controls in front of Nicholas, who during the war had been a flight instructor, by the way. He took over the controls. So that is my scary memory. And when the pilot landed the plane, Nicholas got out and said, well, it was just like riding a bicycle. You will never forget. And we had a cup of tea with milk, and we have never forgotten. And so that is my story of my children Kindertransport rescue to England.
Thank you, Lady Milena, and thank you to all of our speakers. So to our audience, please continue typing your questions into the chat box. We will be getting to them in a little while. Right now, I just want to tell you about what we have upcoming at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So today's program is the end of our, let's say, winter season of the beginning of this year. We are now having a break for about a month. We will have our next program on Sunday, April 23rd. And that is another just unbelievable film. And we hope also to present a beautiful program to you in conjunction with that film. And that is a film called Besa, the Promise. And it's a story about Albanian Muslims who saved Jews during World War II. We had another program showing another film about the Albania story. Even if you saw that film, even if you know the Albania story, you will still want to sign up for this program, because it not only tells the larger story of that quite remarkable rescue, but it tells a specific story of one specific family that made a promise, a Muslim family that made a promise, an oath to the Jewish family that they saved, and it follows that family. And we're going to have a member of the Muslim Albanian family and the Jewish family on our panel, as well as Dr. Paldiel and the filmmaker, and that really promises to be another exceptional program, I hope. So then we're going to go on a little bit of a different schedule. We're going to try, instead of presenting films every Sunday, as we've been doing since January, we're going to go on a different schedule, which is every 2 weeks. We hope that you, our audience, will still stay with us, even if it's every 2 weeks. And we promise to bring you more beautiful stories like that we're bringing you today. So now let's see a little trailer for the film Besa, the Promise, and then we'll get to your questions.
How many people would lay down their lives for a stranger?
Got it, got it.
Albanians would.
Hello, I'm Norman Gershman. Very pleased to meet you.
Your family rescued this Jewish family under the Nazis. You're Muslims, is that correct?
Yeah.
It was this collective agreement amongst the people to save people.
Emri im është Recep Hoxha. Babai nuk vetëm dëshironte që për hebrejt të kryente veprimin që i mbeti si kështu pa realizuar.
למה ההורים שלי עשו את הדבר הזה? זה מנקר לי עד היום.
For 60 years he's got these books. But they must be returned.
Edhe në kulturën tonë, themi kur t'jepet një amanet, që thuhet një detyrim, pesa është edhe tek kjo, tek fjala e dhënë.
The journey was almost a year to find this Jewish family.
Kur një njeri jeton gjatë me këtë ide dhe që erdhi u afruam në zgjidhje. U afruam drejt zgjidhjes, besoj. Është shumë e bukur.
The door is open.
So after today's program, you will receive an email with information about signing up for our program, Bessa the Promise, and I hope you will. So now let's get to your questions, and there are quite a number of very interesting questions. The first one I want to bring up is one of our audience members says, I was unaware that some of the families who took in the kids were not Jewish. In fact, most, I think, were not Jewish, and also the fact that some of the families used them as servants. Could we talk about this a bit? So I don't know who would like to take that question.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, again, back to Nicholas Winton, he did receive a visit by two rabbis in the course of bringing the children into England, who were very cross with him because he was placing children with Christian families, as I was, and as we were with my sister. And his answer was, well, would you rather do you want two dead Jews or do you want two live Jews? And that was his answer.
Would anybody else like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I'd like to say that, yes, of course, they couldn't find, the Jewish community couldn't find enough Jewish people who would agree to host these children in their home. Some of them said they don't have room for that. They're living on a tight budget. And so there was no other choice but to place them in non-Jewish homes. The problem arose, some of these children came from Orthodox families. And suddenly they landed in a non-Jewish home, and those non-Jewish people knew nothing about the Jewish religion. They didn't know anything about kosher food. So one such story is, one with such family was told that Jews, they don't need ham, they don't need anything ham, but they're allowed to eat fish. So they prepared, one day, the children came down for dinner, and they found lobster on their plate. And they told the host, oh, lobster, we're not allowed to eat. And the host said, but these come from the water. I thought anything that comes from under the water. And they, yes, but it's got to have fish. It's got to have scales and fins, according to the Bible. And a lobster doesn't have scales and fins. So the thing is, these host families, they try to do their best.
Great. So let's go to some more questions. So I think this is for you, Mark.
Okay.
Two questions. One, how did you find the children to interview for the film, the children, quote unquote? And were there some survivors who refused to reflect on their experiences?
We found most of our subjects through referrals. Some people had written about their experiences. They had written memoirs, they had written books. We had researchers look at tapes, interviews done by the Shoah Foundation. And it's interesting. I think that Lady Milena knows Vera Gissing, who has written extensively about her experiences. And when we went to film her, her sister Eva was also there. Eva came from Australia. We didn't know anything about Eva, but both of them, we interviewed both of them. And Eva, who had really not talked about her story very much, was much more emotional than Vera, who had spoken so many times about her story.
Mhm.
Talked to that it was no longer immediate.
Right.
And Eva was, I mean, part of making the film was getting people to be in the moment, to relive their experiences. And Eva was incredibly present at that time.
And also for you, Mark, the incredible visual material that you present. You have childhood photos. You sometimes have videos. It looks like home movies. I mean, how did you get the material for this film?
We had a wonderful researcher, but you keep looking. When you make an archival film like this, you start looking at the beginning of production and you keep looking for footage until the very last day. We were looking for a special kind of footage. We were looking for always a child's perspective. So we found footage that other people may have overlooked. For instance, the image of the balloons. There's also the image of a German Nazi soldier that you see from the boots up to his waist. That's a child's perspective in a crowd. That might be footage that other filmmakers would reject. But that was our direction to our researchers. And we looked very hard. That's what you always do.
So we're coming to the end of the hour. And so I'm wondering, Lady Milena, if I can ask you for some final thoughts, what would you like to say to our audience in closing?
Well, I would really like to thank the Mandis Foundation, dedicated to for inviting me to take part in this presentation and introducing to the world another group of people called Safe Passage, which I think you're going to be showing, Matthew, who saved the lives of many people through their work, just as Aristides Mendes had done. And I would really want to end up by 4 lines written by Gerda Meyer, who was a poet as a child, rescued, one of the first children rescued from Prague. All the leaves have lost their trees. Child, what tumbled words are these? And yet I grieve for my lost tree. Far away the wind bore me. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, our filmmaker, with, by the way, those 2 Oscars behind you over your shoulder. Why don't you point to them for our audience?
Further back, yes, they're getting a little tarnished.
Well, boy. So what would you like to say in closing to our audience?
The British rescue, the Kindertransport, as Mordecai pointed out, was unique at that time. An act of kindness that was not replicated by any other country at during the war. We're now at a time, again, where we see an enormous number of refugees going from one country to another. We're in the middle of a war between Russia and Ukraine, where millions of Ukrainians have fled to Poland and other countries. Many Russians, to avoid conscription, have fled. We need to not repeat the mistakes that were made in the 30s about our unwillingness to take in refugees. Refugees are going to increasingly become a worldwide problem. And the Kindertransport shows what can happen when a country can extend kindness to other people.
Dr. Paldiel, Mordechai.
Okay, my final thoughts are, I'd like to say what was not talked today is not so much the children, but the parents of the children. I just want to say a few words that they had to let go of their children without even knowing who's going to host them, who's going to take them, where they'll wind up. Because what happened, the system was that they had to sign a statement, the parents, in which they gave up their children to that organization. The organization promised them we were going to find for them a suitable home. We can't tell you now where, what, how. We haven't yet finalized that, but we'll do our best. And then the children will be able to write to you, and you'll be able to exchange letters. This is still before the war, when letters. So you can imagine parents having to abandon their children and not even knowing where they'll wind up. This is something unknown and unheard of. There are cases in the Holocaust, which I dealt with at Yad Vashem, where parents gave up their children to other people whom they knew from before, non-Jewish people. But in this case, they had no idea where these children are going to wind up. And these children came to England without one word of English, and you can imagine the adaptation that was needed there. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to point out, so it's the pain of the parents here also has to be appreciated, that they were trying to do the best for their children. The other thing, the children, of course, didn't understand it. Some of the children felt that they're being abandoned by their own parents for some reason, that because they misbehaved or their parents stopped loving them. But that's a different story. The other thing is we seem to forget, we talk about 10,000 children. We seem to forget 1.5 million Jewish children were killed by the Germans, by the Nazis. 1.5 million. Imagine, Mark Harris said, we talk about 10,000, we have 10,000 stories. Imagine if 1.5 million of these children had survived, we would have had 1.5 million stories of these children. And who knows how many of these children would later on, if they survived, how many of them would turn out to be like Kirk Douglas, George Burns, and all these entertainers, that I mentioned before, that they were children and grandchildren from people who fled from the pogroms and they came to this country. So that is a severe loss of life, opportunity, and cultural advancement and progress that cannot be redeemed. And finally, I want to say something. So if I can see the last slide. Okay, so one of the lessons of the Kindertransport and one of the lessons of the unwillingness of the Western allies to admit these refugees youth is you are sending the wrong signals to the Nazis. The Nazis are thinking that that since the rest of the world doesn't want the Jews, then it's permitted to take it a step further and actually eliminate the Jews, take them away, take their life away. Joseph Goebbels, one of the most powerful Nazi leaders, very close to Hitler, kept a diary. And in 1943, he wrote, and this diary is available for anyone who wants to read it. He said, at bottom, however, I believe that both the English and the Americans are happy that we are exterminating the Jewish riffraff. Riffraff means the Jewish garbage, in other words. They really believe that they were doing a service to the rest of the world, that the rest of the world really didn't mind. Well, the rest of the world did mind. The rest of the world did not agree with that, but by closing their doors to refugees, they were sending the wrong signals to these demented minds at the top of the Nazi leadership. So you don't do that when you're dealing with people like Nazis. that should be a lesson for future leaders and future generations. Now, I mentioned for people who want to read more about this, there are two books written by David Wyman. David Wyman was not Jewish, he was an American Presbyterian historian, and he wrote two books, Paper Walls, that's the period of the American anti-refugee policies from up to World War II, when America entered the war in 1941, and then The Abandonment of the Jews is a more comprehensive description of how the Jews were simply trapped and how the United States, basically it's about the United States policy of non-admittance to refugees. It's by David Wyman. And then the third book is about the Robley Commission, that commission that existed in 38 and 39 of Robley and Schacht, in other words, both an American and Nazi committee that were discussing possible ways to get the Jews out of Germany into safe havens. And that is a book, it's called Jewish Emigration, 1938-1940, the Robley Negotiations and the Intergovernmental Committee. So these books are available online with Amazon. If you want to read more about what we just discussed, including the Kindertransport, and why the United States did not copy the British model of the Kindertransport and kept this country out of refugees. Okay, this is my final thoughts.
Great. So I would like to thank today's illustrious panel. I would like to thank you, our audience, who come week after week. And I can't forget to thank today's sponsor, who made it possible for many of you today to be in attendance. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, wonderful holidays, Pesach, Easter, as the case may be. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.